The sun was just beginning to set over the jagged horizon as Jack Colton tightened the straps on his backpack, the last rays of daylight glinting off the metal carabiners hanging from his belt. He paused for a moment, looking out over the rolling hills that surrounded the entrance to the uncharted cave system, taking in the serenity of the landscape. It was a stark contrast to the nervous energy that crackled among his team, the four figures standing just behind him, each lost in their own thoughts. "Ready, team?" Jack asked, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the apprehension that had been gnawing at him since they first arrived at the mouth of the cave earlier that afternoon. The question hung in the air for a moment before Emma responded with a firm nod, her dark hair pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail. Emma was the group's geologist, a cool-headed thinker with an encyclopedic knowledge of rock formations and underground ecosystems. She was also Jack's closest friend, the one he trusted most in the unpredictable world of spelunking. "Let's do this," Emma said, adjusting the headlamp strapped to her helmet. The light flickered on, casting long shadows on the rock walls surrounding them. Jack watched as the others followed suit, their faces illuminated in the growing darkness. Eric, the group's designated navigator, stood with a map in one hand and a compass in the other, muttering to himself as he double-checked their route. He was the cautious one, always double and triple-checking everything, a trait that had saved their skins more than once on previous expeditions. Lucy, the youngest of the group and their tech expert, was busy setting up her drone, a sleek piece of technology that would be their eyes in the darkest parts of the cave. She had a confident, almost cocky air about her, but Jack knew it was born out of a deep-seated need to prove herself, to show that she could hang with the veterans. And then there was David, the newcomer. Jack glanced at him, his expression unreadable. David was an enigma, a last-minute addition to the team who had come highly recommended by an old friend. His credentials were impressive: experience in extreme environments, a calm under pressure. But there was something about him that Jack couldn't quite put his finger on. Maybe it was the way he avoided eye contact, or the way he seemed to hesitate ever so slightly before answering a question. Whatever it was, it left Jack with an uneasy feeling, though he couldn't afford to let it distract him now. "Remember," Jack began, his voice carrying a note of authority, "this cave is completely uncharted. We stick to the plan, we stay together, and we don't take unnecessary risks. We've all heard the rumors, but we're here for the facts. Stay sharp, and if something doesn't feel right, we turn back." The group murmured their agreements, and with one last look at the sky, now fading to twilight, Jack turned to the gaping black maw of the cave. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, the cool, damp air wrapping around him like a shroud. The others followed, their footsteps echoing off the narrow walls as they descended into the earth. The first stretch of the cave was as expected, narrow passages that twisted and turned, with the occasional widening into larger chambers where they could stand and stretch. The walls were lined with intricate stalactites and stalagmites, their formations a testament to the millennia that had shaped them. The team moved in silence, each member focused on their role, the only sounds the soft crunch of gravel underfoot and the steady drip of water from unseen crevices above. After what felt like hours, they reached a larger chamber, its ceiling soaring high above them, lost in the shadows. Jack signaled for a break, and the group gratefully dropped their packs, taking a moment to catch their breath and hydrate. Emma knelt down to examine the rock around them, her fingers tracing the lines in the stone with a practiced touch. "It's limestone," she said, her voice echoing softly. "This whole system could be full of hidden chambers, even underground lakes. The possibilities are incredible." Lucy nodded, her eyes already scanning the area for a place to launch her drone. "I can't wait to get some aerial footage of this place. If the rest of the cave is anything like this, we're in for a real treat." Jack smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. He shared their excitement, but there was a heaviness in his chest that he couldn't shake. It was that sixth sense, the one that had kept him alive in the most dangerous caves around the world. Something was off, and he knew better than to ignore his instincts. "All right, everyone," he said, rising to his feet. "Let's keep moving. We've got a lot of ground to cover before we make camp for the night." The team gathered their gear and pressed on deeper into the cave. The air grew colder, the light from their headlamps barely piercing the darkness that seemed to thicken around them. And then, as they rounded a corner into a narrower passage, Jack stopped abruptly, his breath catching in his throat. There on the wall were the markings, strange, almost alien symbols carved into the rock, faintly glowing in the dim light. They were unlike anything Jack had seen before, jagged lines and twisted shapes that seemed to tell a story, though one he couldn't begin to understand. "What the hell is this?" Eric whispered, his voice tinged with unease as he ran his hand over the markings. Emma stepped forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. "These aren't natural formations. These are man-made, but they're ancient. Prehistoric, maybe. Or something else entirely," David murmured, his eyes fixed on the symbols with an intensity that made Jack's unease deepen. "What do you mean?" Jack asked, his tone sharper than he intended. David hesitated, then shrugged. "Just something about these feels wrong, like a warning." The words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Jack shook his head, trying to dispel the growing sense of dread. "Whatever they are, we need to keep moving. Stay close and stay quiet." The group fell back into formation, their pace slower now, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them with every step. The passageway began to narrow even further, forcing them to squeeze through tight spaces that seemed to close in around them. The air was thick with tension, each member hyper-aware of the silence that surrounded them, a silence that felt almost unnatural. Finally, they emerged into another chamber, but this one was different. The walls were lined with bones, old and brittle, some still partially buried in the loose gravel. The skeletal remains of long-dead explorers, their final resting place a cold, forgotten tomb deep within the earth. Lucy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God!" The oppressive silence that had settled over the group weighed heavily as they stood frozen at the edge of the chamber, their eyes fixed on the remains scattered across the floor. The horror of their discovery was still sinking in, the implications clawing at the edges of their minds. The bones were old, brittle with age, but the gnaw marks were fresh, too fresh. Whatever had done this was still down here, and it was hungry. Jack Colton forced himself to breathe, his chest tight with fear. He could feel the eyes of his team on him, waiting for his next move, his next command. but for the first time in years, he was unsure of what to do. The crawlers, those pale, insect-like creatures that had appeared from the darkness, had vanished just as quickly as they had come, retreating into the shadows as if toying with their prey. "Jack," Emma's voice cut through the silence, her tone calm but strained. "What are we dealing with here?" He looked at her, saw the tension in her eyes, the way her hand hovered near the pickaxe strapped to her belt. She was ready for a fight, but Jack knew that fighting these things would be suicide. They were in the creature's domain now, and the rules had changed. "I don't know," Jack admitted, his voice low, barely more than a whisper. "But whatever they are, they're intelligent. They're hunting us." A shiver ran through the group at his words, the finality of the statement sending a wave of cold dread through their bodies. David, the enigmatic newcomer, stood apart from the group, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the walls of the chamber. Jack noticed the way his gaze lingered on the strange symbols carved into the stone, the same markings they had seen earlier. "These symbols," David said, stepping closer to the wall, his voice distant, as if he were speaking to himself more than the others. "They're not just hieroglyphs, they're warnings." "Warnings?" Eric echoed, his skepticism breaking through his fear. "Warnings of what? We've seen them all over the place, but they don't make any sense." "They make sense if you know what to look for," David replied, his tone darkening. He traced his fingers over the carvings, his expression unreadable. "This isn't just a cave. It's a tomb. The people who came before us, they tried to seal these creatures inside. These symbols, they're part of a ritual, something meant to keep the crawlers contained." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "How do you know this?" David hesitated, and for a moment Jack thought he wouldn't answer. But then David turned to face him, his eyes hard, filled with a grim determination. "Because I've seen it before," David confessed, his voice barely audible. "I was part of a research team sent here years ago. We were supposed to study these caves, figure out what made them so dangerous. But we didn't know. We didn't realize what was down here. The crawlers. They killed everyone. I barely made it out alive." The weight of David's words hung heavy in the chamber, the truth of his past finally revealed. Jack felt anger rising within him, but he pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. Now wasn't the time for recriminations. "You should have told us," Jack said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "We could have been better prepared." David met his gaze, unflinching. "I didn't think they would still be here. I thought the cave had been sealed, but it wasn't enough. They're still trapped down here, and now so are we." "So how do we get out?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling. She was trying to stay calm, but the fear was clear in her eyes. "There's got to be a way." "There is," David said, glancing back at the symbols. "But it's not going to be easy. These markings, they're part of an ancient ritual. We need to complete it to weaken the crawlers, drive them back long enough for us to escape. But we have to find the source, the place where the ritual was originally performed." "And where would that be?" Emma asked, stepping forward, her gaze steady. "Do you know?" David nodded. "I think so. The chamber I saw during my last expedition, it had symbols like these, but more intricate, more powerful. If we can find it, we might be able to reactivate the ritual. But we'll need to move fast. The crawlers, they're watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake." A heavy silence fell over the group as they absorbed David's words. It was a dangerous plan, filled with uncertainty and risk, but it was the only option they had. The alternative, being hunted down in these dark tunnels one by one, was too horrific to consider. Jack made the decision. We'll do it. We find this chamber, we complete the ritual, and we get out of here. Everyone, stay close, keep your lights on, and move quietly. If we're lucky, we can avoid any more encounters with those things. The group nodded, their determination rekindled by the possibility of escape. They moved out, Jack leading the way with David by his side, guiding them through the labyrinthine tunnels. The walls seemed to close in on them as they ventured deeper, the air growing colder, the darkness thicker. Every sound echoed ominously, every shadow seemed to move, and the sense of being watched never left them. As they walked, Jack couldn't help but glance at David, a question burning in his mind. Why didn't you tell us earlier about what happened? David didn't look at him as he responded, his voice low. Because I was trying to forget. I didn't want to remember what happened down here, the things I saw. But when I saw the symbols again, it all came flooding back. I'm sorry, Jack. I should have warned you. Jack said nothing, his mind racing. There would be time for blame later. Right now, they had to focus on survival. After what felt like hours of tense, silent walking, the narrow tunnel opened up into another chamber. This one was different, larger, with high vaulted ceilings and walls covered in the same strange symbols, but far more elaborate and intricate. The air here was thick with an ancient, oppressive energy that made the hairs on Jack's neck stand on end. This is it, David whispered, his voice filled with awe and fear. This is the place. The chamber was dominated by a large circular stone altar in the center, surrounded by more bones and the remnants of what looked like ancient tools and weapons. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse faintly with a dim, otherworldly light, as if responding to the presence of the living. Emma approached the altar, her face pale as she examined it. These symbols, they're different from the others. They're more detailed, more complex. If this is where the ritual was performed, we need to figure out how to complete it. How do we even begin? Eric asked, his voice tinged with despair. We don't know what any of this means. David stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly. I think I can decipher it. The research we did years ago, we found fragments of the original ritual. It was incomplete, but I think we have enough to piece it together. We need to activate these symbols, one by one, in a specific order. But once we start, we'll be vulnerable. The crawlers will sense the energy, and they'll come for us. A cold dread settled over the group as the implications of David's words sank in. They were about to poke the hornet's nest, and there was no guarantee they would survive the swarm. Do it, Jack ordered, his voice firm. We'll hold them off. Just tell us what you need. David nodded, swallowing hard as he moved to the altar, his fingers tracing the symbols, searching for the right sequence. Jack and the others spread out, forming a defensive perimeter around the chamber, their lights scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The tension was suffocating, every second stretching into eternity as David worked. The only sounds were the faint scratching of his fingers against the stone and the ragged breaths of the team. And then, as David activated the first symbol, a low, guttural hiss echoed through the chamber, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against rock. The crawlers were coming. Jack gripped his pickaxe tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. "Everyone, stay sharp! Here they come!" The chamber seemed to tremble as the crawlers emerged from the shadows, their pale, elongated bodies slipping into view, their blind eyes useless, but their ears finely tuned to every sound. They moved with eerie grace, their movements fluid and predatory as they closed in on the team. Emma was the first to react, swinging her pickaxe at a crawler that lunged at her, the creature shrieking as the blow connected. But it wasn't enough to stop it. The crawler retaliated, slashing at her with razor-sharp claws, but Emma dodged, keeping it at bay. Eric and Lucy fought back as well, using their tools to fend off the creatures. The crawlers were relentless, their hunger driving them forward despite the pain. Jack joined the fray, striking at any creature that got too close, his movements precise and controlled, even as his heart raced with fear. "How much longer, David?" Jack shouted, his voice strained as he swung at another crawler, barely avoiding its fangs. "Almost there," David called back, his voice tight with concentration. "Just a few more." The crawlers were closing in, their numbers overwhelming. For every one they managed to wound, two more took its place. The team was being pushed back, the perimeter shrinking as the creatures pressed forward, their hisses filling the chamber. David's voice suddenly rang out, filled with urgency. "Now! It's done!" The symbols on the walls flared to life, glowing with an intense, blinding light that filled the chamber. The crawlers shrieked in pain, their bodies writhing as the energy from the ritual washed over them, forcing them back. "Run!" Jack shouted, grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her toward the tunnel. "Now!" The team didn't need to be told twice. They bolted for the exit, the crawlers still howling in pain behind them. The light from the ritual provided them with a temporary shield, but Jack knew it wouldn't last. They had to get out of the cave before the creatures recovered. They raced through the tunnels, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding in their chests. The darkness closed in around them, but they kept moving, driven by pure survival instinct. Jack looked at his team, Emma, Eric, Lucy, and David, all of them alive, but forever changed by what they had experienced. "We did it," Emma breathed, her voice hoarse. "We actually did it." "Yeah," Jack replied, his voice hollow. "But at what cost?" The group fell silent, the weight of their ordeal settling over them like a heavy blanket. They had survived the Chamber of Secrets, but the horrors they had witnessed, the crawlers, the ancient ritual, it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The world outside the cave seemed like a distant memory as the group pressed deeper into the labyrinthine tunnels, their breath shallow, their movements deliberate and cautious. The glow of their headlamps cut thin beams through the oppressive darkness, but it did little to ease the growing sense of dread that clung to them like a second skin. Jack led the way, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next, his grip tight on the handle of his pickaxe. Behind him, the rest of the team moved in tense silence, their footsteps muffled against the damp stone floor. The echoes of their earlier encounter with the crawlers still reverberated in their minds, a chilling reminder of the predators that lurked just beyond the edge of the light. The Chamber of Secrets had been left far behind, but the memories of the pale, monstrous creatures that had attacked them lingered. making every creak and whisper in the cave feel like the prelude to another ambush. Jack knew they were being hunted. He could feel it in the air, thick with the scent of earth and something more primal, more malevolent. "We need to keep moving," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of dripping water. "We can't stay in one place for too long." Emma, who had been close behind him, nodded in agreement. Her face was pale, drawn tight with exhaustion, but her eyes were sharp, focused. She kept her hand on the pickaxe at her belt, ready to strike at the first sign of danger. The others followed her lead, their weapons held at the ready. David was the only one who seemed out of sync with the rest of the group. His gaze was distant, his movements mechanical, as if he were lost in some private hell. Jack had tried to talk to him, to bring him back to the present, but David's answers were short, clipped, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Whatever secrets David had been holding back, Jack knew they were still weighing heavily on him. Lucy walked at the rear, the drone she had relied on so much, now a useless piece of equipment strapped to her pack. The crawlers had made quick work of it during their last encounter, leaving her with nothing but the small survival knife she had tucked into her belt. She scanned the shadows nervously, her headlamp casting erratic beams across the walls. Eric, positioned in the middle, kept his compass in hand, though the needle spun uselessly, unable to find true north in the twisted passages. He had stopped relying on it, instead trying to navigate by memory and gut instinct. But Jack could see the strain in his eyes, the creeping doubt that they might never find their way out of this hellish place. As they pressed on, the tunnel began to narrow, forcing them to move in single file, each step accompanied by the unsettling sound of rocks shifting underfoot. The air grew colder, the walls damp with moisture, and the ever-present darkness seemed to thicken around them, as though the cave itself was closing in, eager to swallow them whole. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft scuffling of their boots and the occasional drip of water. But then, just as Jack began to think they might have a moment's respite, a sound reached his ears, a faint rhythmic clicking, growing steadily louder. Jack froze, raising a hand to halt the group. The others stopped in their tracks, their breath hitching as they strained to listen. The clicking was unmistakable, and it was getting closer. Jack's pulse quickened, adrenaline surging through his veins as he realized what it meant. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to find cover now." Without waiting for a response, Jack scanned the tunnel, searching for any sign of an alcove, a crevice, something, anything they could use to hide from the crawlers. His headlamp swept over the walls, revealing only solid rock, until it caught a glimmer of hope. A small, narrow passageway branching off from the main tunnel, just wide enough for them to squeeze through. "There," Jack hissed, pointing to the passage. "Get in, quickly." Emma was the first to move, her heart pounding as she ducked into the narrow opening. The others followed in quick succession, their movements hurried but careful, desperate not to make a sound. Jack brought up the rear, casting one last glance down the tunnel as he slipped into the passage, the clicking now close enough that he could almost feel it vibrating through the walls. They pressed themselves against the cold stone, barely daring to breathe as the crawlers approached. The passage was tight, claustrophobic, forcing them to remain motionless, their backs against the wall, their faces turned toward the darkness. The clicking grew louder, filling the tunnel, echoing off the walls in a maddening rhythm that set Jack's teeth on edge. For a moment, it seemed as though the creatures would pass them by, unaware of their presence. But then, the clicking stopped, and a new sound emerged, soft, almost inaudible at first, but growing steadily more distinct. It was the sound of sniffing, like a bloodhound catching the scent of its prey. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as he realized the crawlers were searching for them, using their keen sense of smell to track them down. He could feel Emma trembling beside him, her fear palpable in the confined space. David's breathing had grown ragged, his eyes wide with panic, while Lucy clutched her knife so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The sniffing grew louder, more insistent, and Jack knew it was only a matter of time before the crawlers found them. He had to do something, anything, to distract them, to lead them away from the group. But what could he do? They were trapped with no room to move, no weapons that could match the crawlers' ferocity. Then, in the midst of the mounting terror, Jack's mind latched onto an idea, dangerous, reckless, but their only chance. He reached into his pack as quietly as he could, fingers brushing against the small bundle of flares he always carried for emergencies. If he could light one, throw it far enough down the tunnel, it might distract the creatures, draw them away from their hiding spot. Jack motioned to the others, indicating his plan with a nod. Emma's eyes widened in understanding, and she gave a barely perceptible nod in return. The others followed suit, their expressions grim but determined. Taking a deep breath, Jack gingerly pulled out one of the flares, its metal casing cool against his palm. He held it up, ready to strike it against the rough stone of the passageway. The clicking was right outside now, the crawlers mere feet away. He could feel the vibration of their movements through the rock, hear the scraping of their claws as they searched for the source of the scent. With one swift motion, Jack struck the flare against the wall. It sparked, the red light blazing to life in the confined space, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The crawlers reacted immediately, their clicking escalating into a frenzy as the light pierced the darkness. Jack wasted no time. He hurled the flare as far as he could down the main tunnel, its red glow arcing through the air before clattering to the ground several yards away. The crawlers shrieked, the sound a high-pitched wail that sent a shiver down his spine. The creatures lunged toward the flare, drawn to the sudden burst of light and heat, their pursuit of the group momentarily forgotten. "Go!" Jack hissed, his voice barely audible over the din. "Now, while they're distracted." The group didn't need to be told twice. They slipped out of the narrow passage, one by one, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. Jack kept his eyes on the crawlers, watching as they circled the flare, their elongated bodies writhing in the flickering light. He knew it wouldn't hold their attention for long, but it had bought them a precious few moments. They moved through the tunnel, sticking to the shadows, the adrenaline coursing through their veins, giving them the strength to push forward. The passage twisted and turned, the walls narrowing at points, forcing them to squeeze through tight spaces. But Jack kept them moving, his focus solely on finding a way out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into another chamber. It was smaller than the others they had passed through, but it offered a momentary respite from the claustrophobic confines of the passageway. Jack signaled for the group to stop, to catch their breath and regroup. "We can't keep doing this," Eric panted, his voice strained. "We're running out of places to hide." "I know," Jack replied, his voice laced with frustration. "But we don't have a choice. We need to keep moving, find that chamber David mentioned, and complete the ritual. It's the only way to stop them." David, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since they left the passage, finally spoke up, his voice low and haunted. "There's another way." The others turned to look at him, confusion and suspicion etched on their faces. "What are you talking about?" Emma asked, her tone wary. David hesitated, his eyes flicking to the ground before he finally met Jack's gaze. "When I was here before, there was another chamber deeper in the cave. We didn't reach it, but I saw the entrance. It was different from the others, bigger, with carvings that looked older, more powerful. I think it's where the crawlers are coming from. If we can find it, maybe we can seal it off, trap them inside." Jack considered David's words, weighing the risks. It was a dangerous plan, one that could easily get them all killed. But he knew that staying on the run, constantly hiding, wasn't a sustainable option. If there was a chance to end this nightmare, they had to take it. "All right," Jack said, making his decision. "We'll go for the chamber. But we move carefully, no more risks unless absolutely necessary. Understood?" The group nodded, their resolve hardened by the prospect of a final confrontation. They had survived this long, and they weren't about to give up now. As they set off again, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The crawlers were relentless, their hunting instincts sharpened by the blood in the air, the scent of fear that clung to the group. He knew that every step they took brought them closer to the heart of the cave and to whatever horrors awaited them there. The tunnel began to slope downward, the ground becoming slick with moisture. The air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in around them. Jack could feel the weight of the cave pressing down on his shoulders, a heavy, suffocating presence that threatened to crush the breath from his lungs. And then, just as they rounded a bend, the tunnel opened up into a vast, cavernous chamber. The sight that greeted them was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The chamber was massive, the ceiling lost in the shadows high above. The walls were lined with more of the strange ancient carvings, their details even more intricate than before. But what drew their attention was the central structure, a massive stone altar surrounded by towering pillars that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. "This is it," David whispered, his voice trembling. "This is where it all began." The group approached the altar cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the chamber. The carvings on the pillars seemed to shift and move in the flickering light of their headlamps, the figures depicted in the stone twisting into grotesque shapes that made Jack's skin crawl. As they reached the altar, Jack could feel the power emanating from it, a deep, thrumming energy that vibrated through the very air. The crawlers were close. He could sense them, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for the right moment to strike. "How do we seal it?" Jack asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. David stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached for the carvings on the altar. "We need to activate the ritual," he said, his voice filled with a mix of fear and determination. "But it requires a sacrifice." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the implications of what David had said sinking in. "A sacrifice?" Lucy repeated, her voice shaky. "What do you mean?" David's gaze was fixed on the altar, his expression grim. The crawlers were sealed away before by a sacrifice. Someone had to give their life to complete the ritual. That's the only way to contain them again. Jack's heart sank at the realization. They had come all this way, faced unimaginable horrors, only to find that the price of survival was death. He looked at his team, saw the fear and despair in their eyes, and knew what had to be done. "I'll do it," Jack said, his voice steady despite the dread that gripped his heart. "I'll stay behind and activate the ritual. The rest of you get out of here." "No," Emma protested, stepping forward. "Jack, you can't." "I can and I will," Jack interrupted, his tone firm. "This is the only way. If we don't seal this chamber, the crawlers will keep coming and more people will die. I won't let that happen." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes, but she nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "You're the best damn leader I've ever known, Jack. We'll never forget you." The others echoed her sentiments, their voices filled with sorrow and respect. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down, focusing on the task at hand. "Go," Jack urged them, his voice firm. "Get out of here and don't look back." With heavy hearts, the group turned and made their way toward the tunnel that led to the surface, their footsteps fading into the darkness. Jack watched them go, a sense of peace settling over him as he accepted his fate. Turning back to the altar, Jack took a deep breath and placed his hands on the carvings, feeling the cold stone beneath his fingers. The energy that pulsed through the chamber intensified, the light from the pillars growing brighter, more blinding. The crawlers, sensing the ritual's activation, surged into the chamber, their shrieks filling the air as they lunged toward Jack. But he didn't flinch, didn't waver. He knew what he had to do. With a final, resolute breath, Jack chanted the words David had taught him, the ancient language flowing from his lips as the ritual reached its climax. The light from the pillars exploded outward, engulfing the chamber in a blinding radiance that burned the crawlers where they stood, their bodies disintegrating into ash. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the light faded, leaving the chamber in darkness. When the others finally reached the surface, gasping for breath and blinking against the harsh daylight, they knew that Jack had succeeded. The crawlers were gone, sealed away in the depths of the earth, but at a terrible cost. They stood in silence for a long moment, staring back at the entrance to the cave, each of them grappling with the weight of their loss. Jack Colton, their leader, their friend, was gone, but his sacrifice had saved them all. As they turned to leave, the wind carried a faint echo of the crawlers' last shrieks, a haunting reminder of the horrors they had faced and the courage of the man who had given his life to end them. The hunt had ended, but the memory of the crawlers and Jack's sacrifice would live on in their hearts forever. The cave's oppressive silence was shattered by the ragged breathing of the survivors as they pressed on, the echoes of their footsteps merging with the distant, haunting cries of the crawlers that still reverberated through the tunnels. The relief of narrowly escaping the chamber where Jack had made the ultimate sacrifice was short-lived, replaced by the grim realization that their ordeal was far from over. David led the group now, his face a mask of determination, though his eyes betrayed the turmoil churning within him. Emma, who had been so strong until now, was struggling to keep it together. Her thoughts were clearly still with Jack, and every step deeper into the cave felt like another betrayal of his memory. Lucy and Eric followed closely behind, their faces pale, the strain of the past hours etched into their features. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The tunnel they followed was narrow and winding, forcing them to walk single file. The walls seemed to close in around them, the darkness swallowing the beam of their headlamps, leaving them feeling small and vulnerable. The only sounds were the soft crunch of their boots on the gravelly floor and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling above. It was as if the cave itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment to pounce. As they rounded a sharp bend, the tunnel opened up into another chamber, this one smaller and less foreboding than the previous ones. The walls were smoother here, as though they had been carved by human hands rather than natural forces. In the center of the chamber, there was a large flat stone, its surface polished and oddly clean compared to the rest of the cave. David came to a halt, his gaze fixed on the stone. The others stopped as well, exchanging confused glances as they tried to make sense of the chamber's sudden appearance. "Why are we stopping?" Lucy asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, as though she feared the walls themselves might overhear. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his hand brushing over the surface of the stone, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost detached. "This is it," he said. "This is the place where we end this." Emma frowned, stepping forward to stand beside him. "And this? David, what are you talking about? We need to find a way out of here, not linger in some forgotten chamber." David's hand stilled and he turned to face her, his eyes dark with something that made Emma's blood run cold. "There's no way out," he said simply. "Not for all of us." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Emma took a step back, her heart pounding. "What do you mean? David, we're in this together. Jack, he sacrificed himself so we could make it out. We're not just going to give up now." David's gaze flickered with something unreadable. Regret, perhaps, or maybe something darker. "Jack was a fool," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. He didn't understand the real power of this place. The crawlers. They're not just mindless beasts. They're the guardians of something far greater than any of us can comprehend. Something that I intend to claim. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as the truth of David's words began to sink in. Claim? What are you talking about? You can't control those things. They'll kill you. David's lips curled into a bitter smile. Not if I finish what my team started all those years ago. We were sent here to harness the power of this cave, to tap into the ancient forces that dwell within it. The crawlers are just a manifestation of that power, a power that I can use. But to do that, I need a sacrifice. Emma's stomach dropped as she realized what David was implying. She took another step back, her hand instinctively moving to the pickaxe at her belt. You can't be serious, David. We've lost too much already. We're getting out of here, all of us. David shook his head slowly, almost pityingly. You still don't understand, do you? This cave, it's a gateway to something much larger, much more powerful. I've seen it, glimpsed its potential. The symbols, the rituals, they're the key to unlocking that power. Jack's sacrifice was only the beginning. To complete the ritual, to control the crawlers, I need more. Lucy and Eric had been listening in stunned silence, but now they stepped forward, their expressions mirroring Emma's horror. "You're insane," Lucy spat, her voice trembling with fear and anger. "Jack trusted you, and now you're talking about sacrifices. We've barely made it this far. How can you even think about turning on us?" David's eyes flicked to Lucy, cold and calculating. "You don't have to understand. You just have to comply." Eric, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up, his voice low and steady. "David, you don't have to do this. We can find another way. We can survive this." But David's resolve was unshakable. "There is no other way," he said, his tone final. "This is the only path forward. The only question left is, who will it be?" For a moment, no one moved. The air in the chamber was thick with tension, each of them waiting for the other to make the first move. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, David reached into his pack and pulled out a flare, just like the one Jack had used to distract the crawlers earlier. But this time, there was no intention of distraction. The flare was a signal. Emma's heart raced as she realized what he was about to do. "No, David, don't." But it was too late. David struck the flare against the stone, the red light flaring to life and casting long, flickering shadows across the chamber walls. The effect was immediate and terrifying. From the depths of the cave, the clicking began again, that horrible, rhythmic sound that signaled the crawlers were on the move. "You've doomed us all," Lucy screamed, drawing her knife, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of the crawlers' approach. David didn't flinch. He simply backed away from the group, the flare held high in his hand, a twisted expression of triumph on his face. "Only the strong survive," he said, his voice barely audible over the rising noise. "This is the only way." Emma knew they had to act quickly. The crawlers were coming, drawn by the light and noise. But more than that, David had betrayed them, and they were trapped in this chamber with him, with nowhere to run. "Lucy, Eric, get ready," Emma ordered, her voice sharp with urgency. "We need to get that flare away from him." David saw the determination in her eyes and smirked. "You can try," he taunted, but before he could react, Emma lunged at him, her pickaxe swinging toward his hand. The flare clattered to the ground as David dodged, the light rolling across the floor, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The crawlers' clicking grew louder, closer, their movements now more frenzied as they sensed their prey. Eric and Lucy moved in, their faces set with grim determination. David, however, was fast, driven by a combination of desperation and madness. He grabbed a rock from the ground and swung it at Eric, who barely managed to dodge the blow. Lucy lunged at him with her knife, but David twisted away, using the narrow confines of the chamber to his advantage. Emma snatched the flare from the ground, her heart pounding as she glanced toward the tunnel. She could see the first of the crawlers now, their pale, elongated bodies slipping into view. They were close, too close. "We have to go," she shouted, but David was relentless, his focus now entirely on her and the flare she held. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, lunging toward her. But Emma was ready. She sidestepped his attack, swinging the flare toward him. The light flared in his eyes, momentarily blinding him, and she took the opportunity to strike him across the chest with the pickaxe, sending him crashing to the ground. David gasped, clutching his chest where the pickaxe had struck, his face contorted with pain and fury. You don't understand," he wheezed, his voice filled with desperation. "We could have had it all." Emma stared down at him, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had done. "No," she said quietly. "You were willing to sacrifice us all for your own gain." With that, she turned away from him, her focus now solely on survival. "Lucy, Eric, let's move." But it was too late. The crawlers were upon them. The creatures swarmed into the chamber, their clicking and hissing filling the air as they closed in on the group. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized they were surrounded. The flare in her hand was still burning, its light the only thing keeping the crawlers at bay, but it wouldn't last much longer. "We need to find another way out," Eric shouted, his eyes scanning the chamber for any possible escape route. But the chamber was a dead end, the only way out blocked by the crawlers. They had no choice but to stand their ground. "Form a circle," Emma ordered, her voice strong despite the fear that threatened to consume her. "We protect each other, no matter what." They moved quickly, positioning themselves back to back, their weapons raised as the crawlers advanced. The creatures were relentless, their pale, segmented bodies moving with unnatural speed and agility as they closed the distance. Emma swung her pickaxe, striking one of the crawlers that lunged at her. The creature shrieked, its body recoiling as the blow connected, but it wasn't enough to stop it. It came at her again, its claws slashing through the air, and she barely managed to dodge in time. Lucy was fending off another crawler with her knife, her face set with determination as she fought to keep it at bay. Eric was using a makeshift torch he had fashioned from a piece of wood, swinging it wildly to ward off the creatures. But they were outnumbered, and the crawlers were relentless. Emma knew they couldn't hold out much longer. The flare in her hand was sputtering, its light growing dimmer by the second. David, still on the ground, watched the chaos unfold with a bitter smile on his lips. "You can't win," he croaked, his voice filled with a twisted satisfaction. "They'll consume you, just like they did my team, just like they did Jack." Emma's heart ached at the mention of Jack, but she didn't let it distract her. She swung her pickaxe at another crawler, the flare in her other hand flickering dangerously low, and then, with a final sputter, the flare died. The chamber was plunged into darkness, the only light now the faint, eerie glow from the markings on the walls. The crawlers shrieked, their hisses growing louder as they surged forward, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized they were out of options. The crawlers were closing in, their claws scraping against the stone as they prepared to strike. But just as the first crawler lunged at Emma, something unexpected happened. The markings on the walls flared to life, glowing with an intense blinding light that filled the chamber. The crawlers recoiled, their bodies writhing in agony as the light washed over them, burning them from the inside out. Emma shielded her eyes from the blinding light, her heart racing as she realized what was happening. The ritual, it was still active. Jack's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The power of the ritual was protecting them, driving the crawlers back. The creatures shrieked in pain, their bodies disintegrating into ash as the light consumed them. One by one they fell, their cries echoing through the chamber until, finally, the last of the crawlers was gone. The chamber fell silent, the light from the markings slowly fading until it was just a faint glow on the walls. Emma, Lucy, and Eric stood in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they tried to process what had just happened. We did it," Lucy whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and disbelief. "We're alive." Emma nodded, her heart still pounding in her chest. "Jack did it," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "He saved us." But the victory was bittersweet. They had survived, but at what cost? Jack was gone, and David. Emma turned to where David had fallen, but his body was no longer there. Only a pile of ash remained, the final remnants of a man consumed by his own greed and madness. The group stood in silence for a long moment, each of them grappling with the weight of what they had just experienced. They had faced death, betrayal, and unimaginable horrors. But they had survived. They had made it through the darkness, but they would never be the same. As they turned to leave the chamber, the faint light from the markings cast long shadows on the walls, a haunting reminder of the dangers they had faced and the sacrifices that had been made. The crawlers were gone, but the memories of their time in the cave would linger with them forever, a dark stain on their souls. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The cave still held its secrets, and the true cost of their survival was yet to be revealed. The air in the cave felt different now, charged with the weight of everything that had transpired, yet somehow lighter, as if the darkness that had clung to the walls had finally begun to dissipate. Emma, Lucy, and Eric stood in the eerie glow of the chamber's fading light, their breaths still coming in ragged gasps, their hearts pounding with the residual fear and adrenaline of their narrow escape. The victory was palpable, but so was the cost. "Let's get out of here," Emma whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. The others nodded, too exhausted to argue, too overwhelmed to do anything but follow her lead. The tunnel leading away from the chamber felt tighter now, as if the walls were closing in on them, pushing them out of the darkness and toward the light. The faint hope of freedom flickered in the distance, a beacon of salvation just within reach. But even as they moved toward it, their steps were slow, burdened by the memories of what they had left behind. Emma could still see Jack's face in her mind, the determination in his eyes as he had made the ultimate sacrifice. She had known him for years, had trusted him with her life more times than she could count, and yet she had never imagined this. She had never thought that his life would end in the bowels of this god-forsaken cave, surrounded by creatures that should never have existed, betrayed by a man they had trusted. The silence between the three survivors was thick, heavy with unspoken grief and guilt. Lucy's face was pale, her eyes hollow, as she moved mechanically through the narrow passageway, her mind clearly elsewhere. Eric's usually calm demeanor was cracked, his expression etched with the weariness of a man who had seen too much and survived more than he should have. As they navigated the twisting tunnels, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The crawlers were gone. She had seen their bodies disintegrate into ash, consumed by the light of the ancient ritual. but the unease that had settled in her bones, that had taken root deep in her soul, refused to leave. It was as if the cave itself was alive, watching them, waiting for one final twist, one last cruel joke. They reached a fork in the tunnel, the left path descending deeper into the unknown, the right sloping upward, leading them back toward the surface. Without hesitation, they turned right, drawn by the promise of fresh air and sunlight. But as they moved further up the tunnel, a soft rumble echoed through the cave, the ground beneath their feet trembling. Emma froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The others stopped as well, exchanging fearful glances, the same question burning in their minds. What now? The rumbling grew louder, more insistent, the walls vibrating with the force of it. Emma could feel the panic rising within her, a cold, sharp terror that gripped her chest and refused to let go. She turned to Eric, her voice tight with fear. "What's happening?" Eric's face was ashen, his eyes wide with dread. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice trembling. "But we need to move. Now." Emma's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of fear and desperation. Was this some final defense of the cave, a last-ditch effort to trap them, to keep them from escaping? Or was it simply the result of the damage they had caused, the ancient forces they had unleashed now tearing the cave apart from the inside? It didn't matter. All that mattered was getting out. They rounded a corner, the tunnel widening slightly, and for the first time in what felt like hours, they saw it. A faint, gray light at the end of the passageway. The exit. It was there, so close they could almost taste the fresh air, feel the sun on their faces. Salvation was just ahead. But as they sprinted toward the light, the ground gave a violent shudder, and with a deafening roar, the ceiling above them began to collapse. Rocks the size of boulders tumbled down, smashing into the ground with terrifying force, sending up clouds of dust and debris. "Go, go!" Emma screamed, pushing Lucy ahead of her, trying to shield her from the falling rocks. Eric was just behind them, his face set in a grim mask of determination as he dodged the debris. The tunnel was crumbling around them, the roar of the collapsing rock deafening, the light at the end of the passageway growing fainter with each step. Emma could feel her muscles burning, her lungs screaming for air, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop, not when they were so close. But then, just as they were about to reach the exit, a massive boulder crashed down in front of them, blocking their path, the shockwave knocking them off their feet. Emma hit the ground hard, the air driven from her lungs as pain shot through her side. For a moment, everything went dark. The world seemed to fade away, the sound of the cave's collapse dimming into nothingness. But then, slowly, painfully, Emma's senses returned. She gasped for air, her chest heaving, her vision swimming as she tried to focus. The light was still there, a sliver of hope just beyond the fallen boulder. But it was fading, growing dimmer by the second as more rocks tumbled down, threatening to seal them in forever. "Emma!" Lucy's voice was a frantic cry, her hands grabbing at Emma's arm, pulling her up. "We have to move!" Emma forced herself to stand, every muscle in her body protesting. She turned to Eric, who had already scrambled to his feet, his eyes locked on the faint light of the exit. "We can't stay here," Eric said, his voice rough with desperation. "We have to climb over it." Emma nodded, though she didn't know if they could make it. The boulder was massive, jagged, but it was their only way out. They had no choice. With renewed determination, the three of them approached the boulder, their hands scrabbling for purchase on its rough surface. The ground beneath them was still trembling, the tunnel still collapsing, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Eric was the first to pull himself up, his fingers bleeding from the sharp edges of the rock, but he didn't let go. He reached down, grabbing Lucy's hand and hauling her up after him. Emma was right behind them, her body screaming in protest, but she ignored the pain, pushing herself up, inch by agonizing inch. They reached the top of the boulder, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. But the light was there, so close now, just on the other side. With a final burst of strength, they slid down the other side, their feet hitting the ground with a jolt that sent a shockwave of pain through their legs. The exit was just ahead, the gray light of dawn spilling into the tunnel, and with it, the promise of freedom. They ran, their bodies moving on pure adrenaline, their hearts pounding with the hope that they might actually make it out alive. The final few feet felt like an eternity, the world around them crumbling into dust. But then, finally, they burst out into the open air, the cool breeze washing over them like a baptism. They stumbled out of the cave, falling to their knees in the dirt, gasping for breath, the first rays of the rising sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. For a long moment, none of them moved. They just lay there, soaking in the warmth of the sun, the feel of the earth beneath them, the sweet, precious air filling their lungs. It was over. They were out. They had made it. But even as the relief washed over them, a deep, aching sorrow settled in their hearts. They had survived, but they hadn't all made it out. Jack was gone, his sacrifice the only reason they were alive, and David had been consumed by his own greed, his desire for power leading to his own destruction. Emma turned her head, her eyes drawn back to the cave's entrance, now nothing more than a dark hole in the side of the mountain, partially collapsed, its secrets buried once more. She knew they could never return. The crawlers, the rituals, the ancient power that had dwelled within those dark tunnels. It was all still there, waiting for the next fool to stumble upon it. But for now, they were free. Eric was the first to speak, his voice hoarse and thick with emotion. "We did it," he whispered, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We actually made it out." Lucy nodded, though her expression was distant, her mind clearly still trapped in the horrors they had left behind. "We survived. But at what cost?" Emma didn't have an answer. She didn't know if there was an answer. All she knew was that they had faced something unimaginable, something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And though they had escaped, they would never truly be free of the cave's grip. Slowly, painfully, they rose to their feet, leaning on each other for support. The mountain loomed behind them, a silent sentinel, its dark secret hidden once more. They turned away, their steps unsteady as they began the long trek back to civilization. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain, but its warmth did little to chase away the chill that had settled in their bones. They walked in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, their own grief. The road ahead was long, but they would take it one step at a time, together. As they descended the mountain, Emma stole one last glance at the cave, a shiver running down her spine. She could almost hear the faint, distant echo of the crawler's shrieks, a haunting reminder of what lay within. The darkness was still there, still waiting, and she knew it always would be. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. The three survivors continued down the path, the sun climbing higher in the sky, their shadows stretching out before them. They were different people now, changed, hardened, but also stronger. They had faced the darkness and survived, and though the scars would remain, they would carry on, living the lives that Jack had given them. And as they walked, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, distant sound, a sound that might have been the last echo of a dying cave, or perhaps, just perhaps, the quiet laughter of a man who had found peace in the end.